Hi, hello, and welcome to the YA ThrillerCon Masterclass on psychological formulations for character development. I'm Kit Mallory. I'm the author of the YA dystopian duology Blackout and Sparks, which is this one. This workshop is all about how writers can use psychological theory to develop complex, believable, and three-dimensional characters. So you might be asking yourself, what exactly is a psychological formulation? Well, basically, formulations help us to map out and make sense of how our thoughts, feelings, physiological reactions, and behaviors are all connected to each other, and how they're connected to our relationships, our circumstances, our past experiences, and our biological makeup. So a whole bunch of stuff in there. And this also helps us to understand why different people interpret and behave differently in the same situation. So why am I qualified to run this workshop? Well, my day job, alter ego, is a mental health nurse and a cognitive behavioural therapist. I've been qualified for 12 years. I've worked in a whole range of settings and client groups. As a writer, I get a lot of positive feedback about my character development and my representation of mental health issues, fortunately. And honestly, I think this whole topic is absolutely fascinating. I'm a big nerd about the whole thing, and I'm so lucky that I've got to spend my career learning about it, essentially. So today I'm going to share with you some of the knowledge and tools that have helped me. So the first thing I want to say is that although formulations are commonly used as a tool in therapy and in understanding mental health conditions, so we're about to see they don't just apply in the context of mental ill health, but to all humans. And whether you're here because you want to increase your understanding of mental health representation in your writing, or you just want to develop your characters as fully as possible and understand human psychology, it can really help you as a writer. So we're going to start today with a little bit of a science lesson. I'm going to talk a little bit about the way the human brain has evolved, about the function of emotions, and then we'll move on to looking at different types of formulations and how we use these to develop and better understand our characters, the kind of questions that you might want to ask yourself when you're getting to know your characters, which will really help you figure out how they tick, what makes them who they are. And because this is ThrillerCon, and almost by definition, characters in thriller novels end up dealing with trauma, I'm going to refer in places to the ways that trauma can impact on humans. I think this is a really important thing for writers to understand. I'm really passionate about the importance of accurate mental health representation and the responsibility that we have as writers to depict these things kind of accurately and sensitively, because they are real things that happen to real people. So I'm also going to share one of the formulations that I developed for a central character in the Blackout duology. I do want to assure anyone who's watching this workshop that all of the examples that I'll be referring to are completely fictional. I will not at any point be discussing any examples from my real life professional practice. So just a quick heads up before we get started, as you might have gathered, from this workshop, it will contain some potentially sensitive and emotionally taxing material. I hope it's going to be useful and interesting to you, but I am just going to share a few trigger warnings with you in case anybody needs them or wants to take a look at them. So just bear with me 1 second. Share my screen. Apologies. Okay. So content and trigger warnings. Apologies for the delay there. So this workshop contains some references to things like low mood, anxiety, to trauma responses, family bereavement, illness and contamination, shame, totalitarianism, government brutality in the context of talking about my book, minority stress and obsessive compulsive disorder. And if any of those things you might find difficult, I really encourage you to be mindful of your own needs and your responses and to exercise self-care during and after the session if you need to. So I also want to mention that there are certain assumptions that are going to underpin the content of this workshop, and these are the kind of things that I operate by in my professional practice and as a writer in my when I work on developing characters. So this is number one. All emotions have an adaptive and evolutionary function. As a species, we've evolved to experience emotions because they're fundamental to our ability to survive. Number two, the key functions of emotions are to communicate need to ourselves and others, and to motivate us to take action, which is designed to be beneficial to the survival of ourselves or our pack. That leads on to point 3. Humans are pack animals. We're hardwired to survive and thrive as part of a group. And acceptance by our pack is kind of hardwired into our motivations. All emotions and behaviours have a cause, whether or not the individual concerned is aware of that reason. I want to be here clear that I'm not saying that all behaviour is justified or excusable or acceptable, but that there is always a motivation and cause for behaviour. Humans don't behave at random. All behaviour has an effect as well as a cause, whether or not that is internal or external. And finally, the development of personality and mental health. Mental illness is a multifaceted interaction between our life experiences, our early relationships and attachments, social, environmental, and cultural factors, and biological factors. And I think it's really important to kind of hold all of that in mind when we're talking about mental health and mental illness. So I mentioned that we're going to start with a little bit of a science lesson. When we're developing characters, it can be really useful to have a basic understanding of some of the mechanisms in the human brain that we all have in common. And the reason for that is that it helps us to make sense of why humans are wired to behave and react in certain ways in certain situations. The psychologist Paul Gilbert coined the term tricky brains to describe the unique structure of the human brain and the challenges that it can pose to us sometimes. So, and I think that's pretty apt. So let's talk a little bit about our tricky brains. So basically, our brains are made up of 3 parts. They all developed at different stages in our evolution. Sometimes they work together as a well-oiled machine. Sometimes, especially when we're in high stress, high threat situations, they can almost behave as 3 separate systems, and they all have their own competing demands and priorities. Sometimes these can kind of clash a little bit, so that can be tricky for us. So the oldest and most powerful part of our brain is our reptilian brain. And this controls the basic needs that are fundamental to the survival of all animals. So that's food, water, shelter, reproduction, defending against threat. It's what controls our threat system, and it's the associated emotions like fear and anger, which are basically designed to overrule everything else in the service of keeping us alive. And I think that understanding how the threat system and the reptilian brain work is really useful for thriller writers, because the chances are that if you're writing a thriller, your character's threat system is going to be active a lot of the time. And this is really going to influence their thinking, their emotional state, the way that they interpret situations and their behaviour, which of course is what drives plot. So it's super important to us as writers. Next in our evolution is the mammalian brain. Developed next, as with all mammals, it's the part of our brain that's responsible for emotions that bond us to others and shape our behaviour as part of the pack. So things like play, social communication and nurture. And finally, our new brain, developed much more recently in sort of evolutionary terms. It's responsible for the mental processes that are unique to humans, things like logic, reason, abstract thought, theory of mind, so being able to think about what other people are thinking, social awareness, so thinking about how we appear in the eyes of others, thinking about our thoughts, thinking about the past and future. That's a whole lot of stuff we can do. And something that's really, really important to bear in mind, because although all of this is super cool, our brains aren't designed to make us happy. They're designed to keep us alive, and they do their best to be helpful in that regard. But what that means sometimes is that the interaction between our reptilian brain and our human brain can create a number of kind of features and quirks that can end up making our lives more difficult. And of course, when we're thinking about character development, can end up making our characters' lives more difficult. I think these things are really useful to bear in mind. Again, thinking about the fact that you're probably going to be putting your characters in a lot of really stressful situations. It's useful to know kind of what kind of features and quirks we have, that how your characters' brains are probably going to work in these kind of stressful situations. So features and quirks. Human brains are much more likely to remember negatives than positives, because that is what keeps us alive. Our reptilian brain makes very quick and dirty calculations when the threat system's active, and that's designed to make us respond to a threat as quickly as possible. We overestimate threat by default. We have an attentional bias to threat. We find it very difficult to switch our threat system off again once it's used to being on. So I guess that's useful to kind of bear in mind if you've got a character who spent a lot of time in stressful situations or threatening situations. Once they come out of them, they're not automatically going to assume that they're safe. They're still going to feel like there's danger around. And when our threat system's on, we're essentially ruled by our reptilian brain. Our new brain doesn't really get a look in, unfortunately. And it's only later when it comes back online, when things kind of calm down, that our new brain will start to analyse our behaviour through the lens of its human capacities. So I guess example here would be, if you think of a zebra running away from a lion, the old brain kicks in, does its job, keeps the zebra safe, gets out of danger. The lion goes away, the zebra goes back to grazing. Brilliant. Doesn't really think any more about it. But if a zebra had a human brain, if it could do all of the things that I just mentioned, it would have a whole load of additional things to worry about and process. It would be thinking things like, what if I was the one who led the lion here? Why did I just run and leave my herd behind? What if the lion comes back? Do the other zebras think I'm a coward because I ran away? And this kind of maybe sounds a little bit silly, but actually, these are all kind of things that can go through people's minds when in the aftermath of a stressful situation, when they're dealing with the responses that their reptilian brain has triggered, and then afterwards they have time to kind of reevaluate them and think about them through a sort of through a different lens. It's really tricky. We have all of this to contend with. So something super useful to think about when you're putting your characters in a high stress situation, both their instinctive response and their new brain appraisal of the event and their response afterwards. Okay. I'm going to move on a little bit and talk about the function of emotions now. And again, I think this is really, really important for writers to understand because emotions drive behaviour. And what drives plot? Behaviour drives plot. So I've already mentioned that all emotions have an evolutionary function. And that means that they shape our physiology and our thought processes to get us to behave in a way that some part of our brain thinks is going to be helpful. And this, it means it's worth taking time to understand the function of different emotions, because if we know what our character feels, then we can have them behave in a way that's congruent with that. And this will help them feel, I guess, realistic to the reader. It will help the reader connect and empathise with them. So something I want to show you now is a little some examples of kind of common emotions and the function of those things, the effect they have on our physiology, our thinking, and the kind of behaviour that they drive. So, for example, anger is an activating emotion. It motivates us to act in defence if we sense that something important to us is under threat, or if we feel that something unfair or unjust has happened. So it's a threat system response. It activates our sympathetic nervous system. That means that it gets us ready for action, essentially. So our heart rate and breathing increase, our muscles tense, pupils dilate to let more light in, our digestion's inhibited because we don't really want to be digesting things when we're fighting stuff or running away from it. And our thinking changes too. So think about how difficult it is to see someone else's point of view when you're really mad at them. Our brain doesn't want us to be able to see someone else's point of view when we're mad at them, because the action it motivates is to kind of punish and make things fair, to get even. So it doesn't want us to be able to see things from the other person's point of view. This is one of those times when, like, new brain is really hard for it to get a look in, unless we can find a way to sort of regulate that emotion. Sadness, totally different emotion. So there's this kind of theory that sadness, it acts as a kind of reflective or contemplative state when we're faced with a loss, or loss is something that's important to us, or the thwarting of a goal that is important to us. So physiologically, because it's associated with this kind of reflective state, it's associated with decreased physiological arousal and activation. So we get tired, we get lethargic, we don't want to be around other people or interact with them, and physically and cognitively we slow down. Our thinking becomes kind of ruminative and reflective. Oh, sorry, I have skipped ahead a little too much. Apologies. Fear. Really tied to anger. It's a threat system emotion again. So again, the sympathetic nervous system, very, very tied to the reptilian brain. It is triggered when we're in danger, or when something that's part of our pack is in danger. And again, our thinking changes. So we're hyper vigilant. We're looking for trouble. We have this better safe than sorry mentality. And there's all kinds of responses that can happen as a response to fear. So people quite often talk about fight and flight response, but actually there are kind of four sort of main responses to a threat, and the other two are freeze and appease. And those two things tend to kind of come up when we're in a situation that our reptilian brain judges that we can't fight or escape. In those kind of situations, it might our brain might think it's better in terms of our survival to either freeze, to go still, or to try to appease, the threat. So one of these tricky things that again can kind of cause problems with sort of later on. Our reptilian brain reacts really, really fast. We don't get a whole lot of control over that when we're in a really threatening situation. Later on, we might have all kinds of judgments of, about how we reacted to that. Might not fit with our view of ourselves. We might be worried about what other people will think of how we reacted in that situation. And that can be a big part of what kind of causes distress, sort of following on from a stressful or a difficult event. So again, bearing in mind thriller writing, probably lots of stressful things happening for your characters. It's worth thinking about that. How did your character respond in a stressful situation? How do they feel about that afterwards? How does that affect their kind of view of themselves? Joy is a really interesting one. It does have a function. The function is bonding with other people. It activates our parasympathetic nervous system, our soothing system. It shapes our thinking. We become more forward thinking, more positive, more in the moment. In terms of its sort of evolutionary function, it's about kind of encouraging us to kind of share things with others, see closeness and connection with other people. So yeah, really interesting one that I think. Similar with excitement. Excitement is a motivator. It encourages us to pursue goals that are beneficial to our survival. Again, that thing about wanting to share with other people as well. Often when we're really excited about something, the first thing we want to do is tell somebody else. Shame and guilt, interesting ones. They're slightly different, actually. Shame alerts us to a factor when something that we perceive as being innate to us seems to be contrary to the values of our social group, puts us at risk of being ostracized and rejected, is I am bad, creates a big threat system response. In terms of our kind of our kind of role as like a pack animal, it's a huge threat to our sort of survival, so it creates a really significant response. And it's really, really difficult in terms of kind of how we manage it, because of course, if it's something that we see as kind of innate to us, then we're not gonna, it doesn't feel like it can be easily changed. So we don't talk about it. The behavior it motivates is kind of secrecy, silence, withdrawal. It's different to guilt. Guilt is a social moderator as well, but it alerts us when something that we've done goes contrary to our own or our group's values. And because of that, it motivates different behavior, which is about repairing, apologizing, making amends. It feels like something that's fixable, if that makes sense. Again, I think, yeah, these are kind of useful things, I think, to be aware of as a writer. They're important. They're kind of, sort of fundamental in some ways to what it means to be human, I think. So that's a little crash course in emotions. Apologize, kind of whizzing through this. There's some really interesting literature out there about the function of emotions, and I think, if you found this interesting or you want to read more about it, then absolutely, go and have a look into this for yourself, because I see some really, really interesting stuff out there. So. Okay, so enough of the science lesson. We're going to talk a little bit now about character development. So, question to get you started. What do readers see of our characters on the page? Well, that depends on whether they're a viewpoint character, whether we're in their head seeing through their eyes, or whether they're a non-viewpoint character, whether they're being observed by the viewpoint character. If they're a non-viewpoint character, what we're seeing is their facial expression, their tone of voice, their language, what they say, how they behave, their body language, and any sort of like outwardly visible physiological responses, if they're crying or trembling, things like that. What we see about viewpoint characters, we get to see a lot more. We get to know them a lot more, I suppose, a lot more closely, I guess, because we also get to see their thoughts and their intentions, their subjective experience of their emotion, their action urges, what they want to do, not just what they actually do, how that emotion feels in their bodies, their physical sensations, bodily responses. And of course, we get to see their behavior, their tone of voice, their body language, and their dialogue. We get to see their interactions with other people. We get to see how they react to others and how other people react to them. So I think, and again, like each character's emotional state is going to affect all of those things. It's going to affect their body language, their tone of voice, their facial expression, their behaviour. So again, really worth knowing what it is that that person's feeling and what that's driving. And when you're thinking about kind of what's working in a scene, what's not, how people are interacting with each other in a scene. So so we usually will have one character in the scene where we get to see through their eyes, we get to know what's going on in their head, and everyone else we have to infer this from their behaviour and from their non-verbal cues and from what they say, which means that we don't necessarily know why they're behaving as they are. And of course, we might be seeing it through subjective filters. So we might be seeing that character's behaviour through the internal filter of the viewpoint character, who might not have all of the information, who might be putting their own interpretations or kind of guesswork onto what's happening. I think a writer's job is particularly hard because in real life, people do and think and feel things all the time without really understanding why. Often for me, if I'm being grumpy and it's inexplicable, it's usually because I haven't had lunch, but it's hard to work that out at the time. We also see other people behaving in ways that we don't understand, and we never get to find that out why. And that's just life, isn't it? But in a book, that doesn't fly, does it? Whatever your characters do and think and feel, however they behave, at some point, our reader is going to want to understand why that is the case. And they won't be satisfied if that appears to be inexplicable or worse, convenient for the plot. And this is where formulations can really help us, I think. So as a starting point, I want to share a simple hot cross bun formulation that is commonly used in cognitive behavioural therapy. It can help us to map out how thoughts, emotions, bodily sensations and behaviours are all connected to each other and the knock-on effects they all have on each other as well. Thinking back to that little table I showed about the function of emotions. I think one of the most fascinating things about humans is the way that people can experience the same situation in a completely different way. And there's all kinds of reasons for this. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about this as we go on. But one way of demonstrating the power of individual experience on our everyday moods and behaviours is a really simple scenario. So three different people walk out of their house first thing in the morning. Seagull immediately poops on their jacket. I know, what are the odds? All three of them. Let's go out with first person, Audrey. So Audrey thinks, why does everything bad happen to me? I knew I shouldn't have bothered getting out of bed. Why don't I even bother trying? The day can only get worse from here. So poor Audrey, I mean, if that was me, those thoughts going through my head, I would feel pretty rubbish. She might feel really low, dejected, disappointed. Her energy levels might drop as a result. Her thinking will change. She might start imagining all the ways in which the day ahead might go wrong. In terms of her behaviour, that it might mean she's kind of snappy or withdrawn or quiet with her colleagues when she gets into work. And that in turn is going to affect the way people interact with her. It's going to set the tone for the rest of the day. Kind of worst case scenario, she might even feel so disheartened that she just turns around and goes right back home and back to bed. And of course, that thought isn't going to have come out of nowhere. That response isn't going to have come out of nowhere. So it's kind of safe to assume that, if Audrey's having that response in that moment, maybe she was already feeling pretty rubbish before she even left the house. Or perhaps she's had to make a real effort to get out of the house. So she started the day determined that it's going to be a good day. And then there's been this setback and that's kind of wobbled everything. But either way, these are all things that are really important for kind of writers to share some insight into so the reader can really empathise with and feel Audrey's mood and reaction to this event. If it's not something that maybe is kind of like how we would react ourselves, like it's really helpful, I think, if we can kind of show why our character is doing that. So let's leave poor Audrey for a moment and we'll move on to Ben. So Ben gets pooped on. Ben has a slightly different but no less distressing reaction. He thinks, how many diseases do birds carry? What if I get sick? I'm going to smell like bird poop all day. Don't have time to go back and change into a clean shirt. If that was me, having this kind of thoughts, I would feel pretty panicky and stressed and anxious. So if that's how Ben reacts, his heart rate might go up, his threat system's going to kick in, which means his brain is going to start, looking for trouble, and it's going to start seeing potential threat everywhere. Remember that thing about, how we kind of interpret neutral things as negative if our threat system's active. So that might mean that, if what normally he might see as like a neutral expression from his colleague, he might interpret differently. He might interpret them as kind of looking at him and thinking, oh, is that poop? And again, that's going to keep that kind of those stress levels, that anxiety going. And again, this is going to affect his behaviour. So he might keep popping to the bathroom to check his appearance or to make sure he doesn't smell, which might in turn lead people to kind of look at him like, is Ben okay? Like, is everything all right? And then he might wonder why they're looking at him funny. He might decline an offer to go to lunch, or he might keep checking his temperature to make sure he's not getting sick. And all of these things are likely to temporarily reduce his anxiety, at least with regard to the bird poop, but they might trigger other anxieties in time. But he won't be reassured for long. One thing about anxiety is it loves uncertainty, so all it takes is a tiny gap in the door for anxiety to prise it back open and burst back in again with more what ifs. So yes, poor Ben as well. But finally, Cass leaves their house in the morning, gets pooped on, and Cass thinks, that's annoying, but isn't a bird pooping on you supposed to bring good luck? Guess it's a good omen for the day. So their mood is neutral. Perhaps they're a little annoyed about the inconvenience, but not so much that they get stuck on it. Maybe they even lift a little, and they're not too wobbled either way by this minor setback. They get cleaned up, they go about their day. Perhaps they're even a little bit buoyed up by the idea that the universe has sent them a positive sign. They might go into work and they might laugh about what's happened with their colleagues, and in turn their colleagues share with them a similar story, and a minor misfortune then turns into an opportunity to joke and bond with other people. So we can see this kind of like knock-on effect for people, how one event can kind of sort of spiral or snowball either in a positive or negative way, and it can set the tone for a lot of things that happen afterwards. Of course, as I mentioned, none of these things come out of nowhere. There's going to be a multitude of reasons why Audrey, Ben, and Castle all interpreted the same situation so differently. So let's look first at the kind of hit in the moment factors. So there's a few I came up with, but have a look at them, see if you can add any more to the list. The things I kind of thought of, think about kind of like how sort of things going on in the here and now, or sort of like the kind of recent present, might affect the way we interact with the situation. So basic needs: hunger, thirst, lack of sleep, physical exertion, tiredness, physical pain, discomfort, illness, injury, our relationship with other people in the situation, our personal stakes in the situation, how important what we perceive to be kind of a threat or at stake is to us. What else is going on? What else is stressing us out at the moment? What else is worrying us? What are our previous experiences like in similar situations or the same situation? One of those tricky brain things. We're really good at remembering things that happened in the past and learning from it. And in some ways that's cool. But again, if we've not had good experiences with a similar situation in the past, our brain is going to be very quick to be like, remember this, and kind of pop those things up for us. So that can be tricky. Our mood entering the situation, and the effects of medication, and I guess things like alcohol, drugs as well. There's probably a whole bunch of stuff that I haven't thought of or mentioned here. So, do have a think, kind of jot down some things, see if you can think of anything for yourself. And of course, it's not just about what's going on in the here and now. So these in the moment factors are going to be interacting with much more complex, sort of long-standing or historical factors. So for writers, understanding our characters and their backstory well enough to know how they're going to interpret the situation that we put them in and the challenges that they face, that helps them not only to feel well-rounded to readers, but to drive the story forward in a way that's going to make sense. I think another thing that is just endlessly fascinating about humans is that there are so many common themes in the way our brains work, no matter what differences separate us. So if we can show on the page the way that our characters' thoughts and feelings and behaviours make sense in the context of their experiences, if we can drop in little clues as to their backstory or little details that can help give some more context to what's going on for them, I think readers are going to be much more likely to connect with them and be interested in them and want to engage with them, which can only be a good thing. So we're going to talk a little bit now about kind of longitudinal formulations. And what I mean by that is kind of sort of how people's early experiences and their kind of like everything that sort of makes them everything that makes up their kind of life experiences, how that interacts with what's going on in the here and now. So a conventional cognitive behavioral formulation sort of starts with our early experiences and core beliefs. So our core beliefs are kind of deep-rooted and not always conscious. They're quite simple, but they're quite they're quite fixed, and they develop from early experiences and interactions which teach us about the world and about ourselves via our interactions with the world and with other people. And they tend to be beliefs about ourselves, about the world, about other people, about the future, and again, quite simple. So it could be, the world is a dangerous place, or the world is generally a safe place. I am a good person. I am not capable. Those kind of things. Again, quite simple statements. Again, we're not always super aware of these. We got to carry them with us. They're not always in the forefront of our mind, but they tend to make themselves known through the kind of what's going on in our conscious mind. They tend to kind of pop up in the form of automatic thoughts. So we start with our core beliefs. And from our core beliefs develop our rules for living. So our rules for living, again, not always super kind of conscious, we're not always super aware of them, but they are the framework that we develop on the assumption that our core beliefs are true facts. They're the framework we develop to stay safe and look after ourselves based on the assumptions of our core beliefs. So for example, for people to like me, I must always put others' needs above my own. To succeed in life, I must always be hard on myself. So these play out on a day-to-day level, the way we interact with situations, in the way that we think, in the way that in the emotions, that sort of the situations that we're in day-to-day trigger for us. We carry them, with us all the time. Paul Gilbert's compassionate mind model takes this idea a little bit further, and I really like this, so I think it's worth mentioning. So like the traditional CBT model, it starts with our early experiences and shaping our beliefs about ourselves and the world and other people. And Gilbert sort of suggests that these inform our key fears and consequently our best efforts to protect ourselves from these fears becoming reality. And that, our best efforts sort of take shape in the form of our thinking and behaviour. And I really like this model because what it really emphasises is that there is a function to patterns of thought and behaviour, no matter how incomprehensible those things seem to the outside. At some stage, those behaviours made sense in terms of an individual doing their best to cope in the situation they're in with the resources that their life and their circumstances have given them. And I think that's really key as well, is doing your best doesn't look the same for everybody. Not everybody is equipped in the same way to deal with the situations that they're in. And the reason I mention this is because how many times have you read a book and yelled at a character like, oh, why are you doing that? And especially with like difficult or unlikable characters, and I'm going to kind of put that in quotation marks because, to be honest, difficult and unlikable characters are my favourite kind. I think if readers can see why they're doing that infuriating thing, I think we tend to be much more forgiving. So I'm not saying all characters have to be likable, but I think, understanding them goes a long way to sort of helping readers engage with them. So the next step in Gilbert's model is the unintended consequences part, which acknowledges that although these kind of protective behaviours serve, or at least they did at some point serve a function, there's often an unintended downside or a knock-on effect. So if we think about Audrey and Ben, avoiding things or isolating themselves or over-checking or convincing themselves that the worst is going to happen. These behaviours make total sense given that their threat systems are really active and their brains are telling them that their disaster is about to befall them, but they also have consequences. So if Audrey's withdrawn all day, perhaps her colleagues think that she'd rather be left alone, they don't invite her for lunch, and then she wonders what she's done wrong and she feels even worse. And that feeds into the final part of the model, which is self-to-self relating. Kind of our self-perception, and that can kind of unintentionally sort of reinforce our key fears. So again, whistle stop tour formulations. So what are some of the things that inform our core beliefs and these deep-rooted beliefs about ourselves, the world, and other people? So there are so many, and again, I probably haven't listed even half of them here. So do you have a thing about, what you know about your characters? What else you think might fit in this list? But let's go through a few of these and kind of talk through them a little bit. So first thing, seems really obvious. When and where was your character born? And importantly, how did the family fit into the cultural and social context of that place and time? What messages did they get from the society that they were born into and grew up in about their place in it and their worth and their role? I think genogram story is fun. Like, who is around, you know, who's in their immediate and extended family. What are those relationships like between all the different people in those family, in that family? You know, was their birth planned or unplanned? What's their birth order? How does their relationship with their parents or caregivers differ from their siblings if they have siblings? What are their parents or caregivers' life experiences like, and how does this affect the care and the parenting that they're able to kind of provide your character? And here I think it's really important to mention that if your character's kind of parents or wider family system have experienced significant trauma, so war, displacement or genocide, things like that, it's really important to factor that into your formulation and your understanding of how their experience was affected, you know, how their relationship with their children, the parenting of their children, their view of the world. And likewise, if your character has got marginalised aspects of their identity, if they're Black or a person of colour or LGBTQ+, it's really essential to consider how identity-based traumas and you like the threat of violence and marginalisation, discrimination, having to hide aspects of your identity, how all of those things factor into your personal history and development, because they absolutely do. More prosaically, what's the family's financial, housing and environmental situation like? It's a really interesting thing about how kind of environment can affect gene expression, actually. So even things that kind of biology that we sort of tend to think of as quite fixed actually aren't, you know, these things can be affected by, you know, by the environment that we're in, the way we interact with it. So it's really interesting and really important to consider. Is there any family history of mental or physical illness? How is this understood and treated in the context of your book setting? How did it affect the family? How did it affect your character? Who was a primary caregiver? Who looked after them? How available and consistent were they? What messages did your character receive about expressing emotions growing up? Which emotions were allowed or acceptable? Which ones got a response from other people? What was education like for them if they were educated? You know, what were their relationships and their interactions with peers like? What did they find easy or hard? What was their health like? What were the circumstances of their birth? What's their temperament like, and how did that interact with those people around them? Do they have a neurodevelopmental condition like autism or ADHD? And if so, how does that impact on everything else? You know, their education, their social development, their relationship with other people. Again, I want to say, as with the things I mentioned earlier, if you're thinking of writing a neurodiverse character, this absolutely will have interactions with everything else. So it's really important as writers that we do research to make sure it's accurate, that we check things out with sensitivity readers who can kind of give us advice on experiences that are outside of our own. Traumas, adverse life events. Have there been any in your character's life? Again, if you're writing a thriller, probably at some point. What happened, and how did people around them respond to that? What were the knock-on effects? And importantly, what were the person's beliefs about the events, or their interpretation of the event? Who did they think was to blame? I think something that's really important to bear in mind if you're writing characters who've experienced trauma is that it's not necessarily the event itself that creates a kind of specific long-term outcome, but it's the person's relationship to the event, to their understanding of it and their beliefs about it, how it shaped their view of themselves and the world and other people. Again, you know, I just want to mention, you know, minority stress is absolutely a thing. If you're thinking, you know, if you're writing about characters who have marginalized aspects of their identity, and if they have multiple marginalized aspects of their identity, how do those things interact with each other? Equally important to think about. And last but not least, because this is super important too, what protective factors are present for them? What and who made them feel good about themselves? What made them feel capable and competent? What do they enjoy? What are they good at? How much chance did they get to do those things? So, whole lot of information there. But once you've got all this information, and you might not need all of it, but honestly, I really don't think that you can know your characters too well, to be honest. Once you've got all of that, you can start thinking about their core beliefs. And you can start figuring out kind of what other things, what is the filter through which they view the world? Like what do they view everything else through? And the reason this is so important for us as writers is that this can give you the whys that drive your story along. And that's really key, I think. And in thrillers specifically, in order for there to be like a story, your protagonist is going to need to do something at some point that most readers are going to consider to be ill-advised or risky, and narrative tension comes from knowing that a character that we care about is in danger. So why are they doing that? We are, as we've talked about, hardwired to avoid danger. It is fundamental to us. So why is your character bothering? Basically, if you're going to have your character walk over a bed of hot coals, there better be something really good on the other side of it. Maybe someone they love is in danger. That's a motivation most people can get on board with. But if the stakes are more abstract, if the protagonist doesn't have a personal connection to the person or the people in danger, for example, then in my view, there's got to be something more to it than that. Plenty of people know, like sort of academically, what the right thing to do is and still look the other way or back out of taking meaningful action. So why is your character different? What is it that drives them perfectly? I think it's really, really important to consider, because if a character's behavior is inexplicable or, unbelievable to the reader, I think it kind of either means that we've not given the reader enough information, or it means that the character's behaving in a way that suits the plot and that the reader can see through this, which again, not what we want, really. Do you want just a word on like antagonists quickly? I think this is important. So I'm going to put my cards on the table here and sort of say really clearly that I don't believe in the notion of people being born evil. I don't believe in madness or trauma as an explanation for horrifying behavior. I think it's cop-outs as a writer, and I think it makes for two-dimensional antagonists. Many people experience terrible traumas and never harm anybody. The absolute vast majority of people with a mental health problem never harm anybody. I think it's really, really important to be clear about that. So I think, if your antagonist is doing like awful things, there's got to be something much more to it than that. It's going to be a really interesting thing to think about. So remember, humans are usually hardwired towards acceptance from our social group. This is the whole reason we have shame as an emotion. So something really important to consider with antagonists is their behaviour something that is accepted or condoned by their social group? Because that kind of makes more sense then as to why they might do that. Or does it confer power or status? Does it seem advantageous in some way? Because these motivations are relatively straightforward to understand. But if the antagonist is doing something that under any ordinary circumstances is going to lead to kind of a consequence that's completely sort of contrary to what is sort of basic human wiring, we're going to need to understand why. And something that's really helped me, I think, with kind of figuring this stuff out is the idea that everyone's the hero of their own story. But people generally behave in ways that they think are either right or justified. And if we don't believe that our behaviour is right or justified, that's where those kind of really powerful social moderators like guilt and shame kick in and encourage us to correct that behaviour. So what is overriding that for your antagonist? So depending on the kind of book you're writing and who the point of view characters are and the information that's available to them about the antagonist, you might not be able to, or you might not care to give your reader an in-depth insight into your serial killer's psyche. But even so, I'd argue that you still need to know them inside out, regardless of how much of that you choose to share with the reader, because then you can make their behaviour congruent. People aren't generally just indiscriminately awful, and villains, I think, are much more credible and therefore more frightening when they're not just going around killing puppies for the sake of it. When there is some kind of like rhyme and reason to their behaviour, even if it is completely awful. So, how are we doing for time? We've got a little bit of time left. So, just to kind of try and pull this together and sort of show you a little bit about how this works in practice, I'm going to share with you a fictional character formulation from my novels. So the formulation is for Mackenzie, who is a central viewpoint character in both books. So I'm going to demonstrate how a generalized longitudinal formulation looking at early experiences and core beliefs and leads into a cognitive formulation for a particular mental health condition, which in this case is obsessive compulsive disorder. And Mackenzie's formulation is taken from Paul Sapkowski's cognitive model of OCD, which is quite easily available online. So something I want to add to that, just with regard to writing about mental illness, is that in my view, unless you're deliberately setting out to write a specific representation of like a specific experience or condition, I would really strongly recommend getting to know your character first and then considering the effect of their experiences on their psychology and their mental health based on that. And that's how I ended up writing Mackenzie as having OCD. Once I understood what happened to him, the experiences he'd been through, what was going on in his head, it just kind of made sense. So if you are setting out to write a specific mental health condition, I feel like it's really important to sort of think about the kind of how that came about, what was going on in the context of that person's formulation. And again, coming back to that, thing about kind of accurate and sensitive representation, which is super important. If you're writing about something outside of your lived experience, then please do, seek out sensitivity readers and, kind of sort of, check it out, I guess, with people. It makes for richer representation, it makes for richer storytelling and more interesting characters. And I feel like we have a responsibility as writers, again, when we're talking about people's real experiences to, to be thoughtful about that. So I'm going to share a drawing of Mackenzie's formulation. It's hand drawing. It's a little bit rustic, so apologies. I'm afraid that GCSE IT didn't really prepare me for this kind of diagram drawing, so apologies for that, and I hope that you can make sense of it. Again, let me share my screen for a second. Okay, here we are. Hopefully you guys can see that. So let me talk a little bit about, let me sort of set the scene for you. So Mackenzie, in Blackout, the UK has been divided into North and South by a totalitarian regime. It's set in, it was kind of scarily approaching sort of a future about 15 years ahead of us. So it's kind of a little bit close for comfort at this point in time. And in this kind of setup, the north of the country has been cut off from all resources and infrastructure, and a wall has been built across the middle of the country. Mackenzie's a northerner. He's 17 when we meet him in Blackout. He has ended up in the south. He's working as a very skilled thief for hire in Birmingham's criminal underworld. He is in the south illegally, so his whole existence is threat focused. If he's caught by the board, he faces execution. So Mackenzie has fairly severe obsessive compulsive disorder. OCD is a condition where sufferers experience intrusive obsessional worries which cause them significant distress, and these are accompanied by sort of compulsions, so mental or behavioural, which are aimed at neutralising these sort of really distressing obsessional thoughts. So OCD is an anxiety-based disorder. Where it differs from other anxiety disorders is that it focuses a lot around the theme of responsibility. So the primary concern is not only that something bad is going to happen, but the person that's suffering is going to be the blame, either because of something they do or because of something that they don't do. So let's talk, and although I'm showing this as an example and it's a lot around the OCD, I want to be clear that, Mackenzie is not his OCD. He is a kind of a whole person outside of this, and there's a lot more to his character than this, and I think that's really important. And there are parts in the book where he talks about, I guess, like the difference between how he behaves when his OCD is bad and how he sees himself, how he wants to be as a person. And I think that's something that's really important to kind of keep in mind as well. So Mackenzie's early life, he was born in Leeds. He grew up with his parents and his older sister Beth. He had a close-knit family. He was born during this period of economic crisis and the rise of a totalitarian regime, which really encouraged anti-Northern sentiment and fostered this North-South divide. So, the prevailing news coverage, messages from the government and society about, sort of Northerners being sort of less than, being other, that kind of pervaded the environment. So there was kind of like background sense of threat that's escalating during his childhood and his sort of early adolescent years. His dad also has a tendency towards anxiety. Family stresses, they're existing in a world where healthcare is no longer free at the point of access, and there's significant anxiety. His gran becomes ill, the family don't know how to pay for this. The family tried to keep this from the kids, but Mackenzie's very attuned to other people's emotions. And the kind of families trying to hide this sort of inadvertently leads to kind of more of a sense of sort of unspoken or unknown threat. And not all of this is spelled out explicitly in the book, certainly not in the way that I've laid it out here. Not all of this backstory actually makes it into the book, but it really helped me to get a sense of who Mackenzie was, like where his kind of thinking, his patterns of behaviour came from, sort of during the book. So again, I think, even if all of the stuff doesn't make it into the book, it's really useful. So just kind of have in your back pocket as a writer, I think. So instead of kind of laying all this out and kind of having Mackenzie give a very long speech about where his OCD came from, what I tried to do is give some more subtle hints to his kind of past experiences. So, for example, at one point, he tells another character, Skylar, that when he was a young teenager, his parents stopped him from watching the news because it made him really anxious. And then in a separate conversation, he talks about staying up late, worrying about his sister when she snuck out, and staying up late to make sure that she got home safe. So we get some kind of hints about Mackenzie's sense of responsibility towards other people, this kind of tendency towards anxiety. And then the wall goes up. Mackenzie's family died in the aftermath of it. I feel terrible saying this, poor Mackenzie. He ends up kind of looking after himself on his own in the north and then in the south. When he kind of manages in this kind of, he has these kind of real skills. He's a very kind of competent person in terms of his kind of skills at kind of lock picking, breaking and entering, climbing, those kind of things. And again, I think this is where it's really important to kind of consider protective factors, like what is it that's allowed him to kind of function as he has for so long, to be successful, for so long in this really threatening environment, despite all of these stresses, all of these pressures. So yeah, again, really important to think where those protective factors come from, how they kind of play out in people's personalities. So he gets along okay for a couple of years. The OCD is there, but he manages it by essentially being on his own a lot of the time and kind of having quite strict, rigid rules and routines and kind of creating this sort of sense of safety for himself. And then our other viewpoint character, Skylar, comes along and ruins it all for him. Poor Skylar, and poor Mackenzie. So Mackenzie steals an encrypted flash drive from the government headquarters, and Skylar, who is a kind of, let's say, friend and acquaintance, who's also a northerner, steals this from him. They end up very reluctantly on the run together. And Mackenzie's whole world basically comes crashing down at this point. Not only does he have other people to worry about again suddenly, but Skylar has completely destroyed his kind of really carefully constructed sense of kind of calm and safety. And also has, to be fair, put them all in a lot more danger. So Mackenzie's, threat system is not entirely off base here. So we can kind of see how this sort of plays out, and how not only how the difficulty develops in the first place, but also why it gets worse during blackout when he was sort of able to manage beforehand. And what that leads to is sort of, a whole host of kind of, I suppose, a vicious cycle, essentially, where these kind of core beliefs about the world being dangerous and unsafe, being responsible, feeling like I must prepare for the best, I can't let my guard down. I'm only okay if, I do all of these things, then leads into a lot of really understandable intrusive worries and doubts. Which then leads to a whole load of efforts to keep himself and other people safe and to manage that kind of, the fear and the anxiety and those really painful emotions that come with those thoughts and worries and with his past experiences. This is all about, so I think it's really important to stress this is all about Mackenzie's best efforts to look after himself. And, he is doing his best with the resources that he's got. And unfortunately, what sort of happens in this kind of scenario is that although his fears and worries have a really understandable root origin, and the safety behaviours do as well, they can end up becoming a factor that keeps the problem going. So in Mac's case, this is because safety behaviours become a mechanism that really temporarily switches off his brain's alarm system, creates a fleeting sense of safety. But then, of course, the worries don't go away. They keep coming back. And his brain remembers that last time, this was the thing that made him feel safer and less anxious. This creates, again, that sense, I am only okay if I do all of these things. And it becomes almost impossible to resist the reptilian brain's demand to switch that off. And this, in turn, means it becomes more and more difficult to learn and believe that although Mackenzie does inhabit a world that's full of danger, whether or not that danger comes to pass is not contingent on him completing all these rituals. So yeah, so I hope that that has gone some way to sort of illustrate some of what I've been talking about today, and kind of hopefully put a little bit of it into context and made some kind of sense. Um, That's the workshop, pretty much. I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface, here really. There is, there's so much information, so much material available in this area. So, if you found this interesting, if it's piqued your interest, then please do, go. There's a whole wealth of resources, there's online templates if you want to have a go at drawing out your own formulation. Something that might be interesting to do as a kind of place to start is to perhaps try to do a formulation for a character in a book that you really like. So if you can kind of make sense of them from what you know, from what the author gives you of that character. But yeah, as I say, it's a huge topic. It's endlessly fascinating. There's always more to learn. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like a copy of the slides or the transcripts from the session, please do reach out to me via Twitter or email. I want to say a huge thank you to Madeline Dyer for having me and for the massive amount of effort that she's put in to making this whole convention happen. Today's only the first day. There's still 2 more days to go. There's an amazing lineup, so do check out on Twitter or on the website what's coming up next. And if you're interested in checking out my books, they're available on Amazon. So once again, thank you so much for watching. I hope you found it interesting. Good night.